Hey there, welcome to Burnout to Thriving, the podcast where we toss perfection out the window and embrace the beautiful chaos of being a woman in a patriarchal world. I'm Cecilia Manella, your therapist and coach, who's here to help you go from burnt out, stressed, and overwhelmed to empowered and thriving, all without pretending life isn't messy. Each week, we'll chat about the ups, the downs, the real moments of redefining success on your own terms. This is your permission slip to ditch the pressure of perfection. So grab your favorite drink, coffee, tea, water, or maybe a little bit of wine, and join me for honest conversations about what it really means to thrive in this real messy world. Are you ready? Let's do it. Have you ever really considered what self-care is really about? I mean, we all talk about it. It's all over the place. What is self-care and what isn't self-care? And I just find it such an interesting topic. So today we're going to dive into what is self-care and what's the history of it, and maybe how we can transform what it's meant for you so far into a place where it's much more empowered and a place where you can actually say no. Welcome to Burnout to Thriving, where we try to break the script on hustle culture and redefine success on our own terms. I find self-care such a fascinating topic because when I started my career over 20 years ago, it wasn't even a thing we talked about. I mean, it was rarely talked about. And now, fast forward 20 something years, and it seems to be that's all we talk about. And we have framed some interesting activities into the sphere of self-care, or what we like to call, what is self-care. But, this whole idea of caring for ourselves is actually a really new thing. When I did some research into it, because I'm fascinated by the historical pieces and the historical influences of what we do today, I came across information that was kind of surprising, actually, around the origins of self-care, that it only really goes back to the 1950s or 60s. So it's not really an old thing. It's a fairly newish thing when we think about the grand history of human existence. And it was really meant to be a political and medical necessity. It was actually a really strong political movement. And it has roots in the Black community, which is so fascinating to me because we often don't think about self-care having this political influence. But where it came from was really like anti-racist feminist roots. And it was a profound act of resistance with both feminist and Black liberation movement, with kind of some key historical moments, especially around the medical accessibility of Black lives. And that's really where it came from. So some of you maybe have heard of the Black Panthers Party. Maybe you haven't. If you haven't, go look them up, look at some history around that. But really, the Black Panthers established a free healthcare clinics in the United States and food programs and health education initiatives that were a direct response to medical racism and neglect. And that's really where self-care comes from, actually, was this idea of caring for yourself was a political movement. It was about standing up against medical racism and looking at being your own advocate and really pushing back on white supremacist ideology when it came to medical treatment of people. And another adjunct to that is the feminist, reclamation of body and health. And the feminist movement framed self-care as a direct resistance to, let's say, patriarchal control. And what that was is that you got to think about the 50s to the 70s, and we're seeing that even happening right now, where women's stories are non-existent in the medical research. We don't study women. We apply medical research that is done on men towards women. So in this time of the 50s, 60s, and 70s, when we're seeing a lot of activism happening, there was a lot of women's health collectives. And so these were spaces where women could learn about their bodies outside of male medical authority. And this was a revolution at that time. It was a really big act of resistance, and it was politically minded. But a big piece that came out of that, which really influenced personally my own therapy practice and coaching practice is challenging the pathology of everyday experience. So what it is, resisting how women's emotions and bodily experiences were labeled as hysterical, or that they had some sort of diagnosis around it, like it was a disorder that required some sort of medical intervention. And usually that intervention was really a male perspective. So it really stands to push against the pathology of everyday experiences. And that is, I want you to think for a moment of how altering that would have been at that time, and how having self-care was actually a political resistance. I mean, it's shocking when we think about self-care now, because now self-care is rosé all day and bubble baths and buying that cute purse maybe you want, or, spending time with friends. But the roots of this come to a specific place around political ideology and taking a stand. Now, why is that important? You're probably like, Cecilia, what are you talking about, and who freaking cares? It's really important to know the origins of things, where things came from, so we can understand the evolution of something. So if self-care is about a revolution, it's about a resistance against the dominant norm, if it's about standing up to things, how did it become what it is today? I mean, it just makes you wonder. And it makes me realize that everything's been monetized for money. There's this rise of the wellness culture. And I think in so many ways it's fantastic. I think it makes space for therapy, we accept that as a really great way to take care of yourself and process trauma. We have so many wellness books on parenting, relationships, how to be in the world, how to set boundaries. We have all this rise of wellness culture, and it's been absolutely transformative, from health practices to meditation to yoga to integrating Eastern practices to Western culture. We've seen this huge shift. And what is part of that shift was this idea of preventative care. Right? Doing things to prevent illness. And that came into maintenance of your own care, so that it would prevent disease and prevent medical challenges, but also this idea of helping yourself. And the massive expansion of self-help literature and programs has really been amazing. And it's been transformational for so many people. And it has transitioned us to the place that we are today. And the thing that to think about as women, and how we are in the workforce in ways that we have never been in history, is the discourse or the conversation we're having around work-life balance. And some of that ties into the emotional load that women carry and the additional weight in that backpack, and wanting to have some sort of balance in our lives. And I think that's really important. What I've noticed over time that has really shifted self-care, because I started practicing in the early 2000s, is the emergence of social media. I mean, it has been absolutely fascinating to see how platforms like Instagram and Facebook and TikTok have created almost like a visual marketplace for aspirational wellness and self-care products. So what started off as an act of resistance political movement with feminists and people of color, and we're talking about the Black Panthers in the US, and in this movement around moving away from medical practices that were rooted in racist ideology, or really, male-centric in a way, where feminists were trying to get women's voices heard and have education on women's bodies, shifted over time to be a beautiful photo that we see on Instagram and that promotes self-care products. It is, that perfectly curated photo of what we think wellness is supposed to look like, or what it should look like. And because of that, self-care has moved into this very corporate or capitalistic kind of peddling you some products along the way, and thinking that that's going to be your way of actually practicing self-care. But we need to kind of shift out of that. because the companies have gotten really smart and they really do explicitly market products for self-care solutions. And I really want you to take a stand against that a little bit, because it's a word that we use, but we don't really understand what that means, right? It's a word that we use, or a phrase that we use all the time, but we're not really rooting into it. And we're not connecting to our own values. We're not connecting to our own humanity around it. I think we need to really rethink this. And because it's easy to think that we can just grab a product and somehow that's going to make us more self-care focused. The shocking thing that I found out is that in today's self-care market represents about $450+ billion of global wellness industry. And we're talking about everything from beauty products, fitness, nutrition, sleep, mental wellness apps, home goods, travel, apparel, everything, box services, membership programs, anything that's Instagrammable or shareable. We're talking about celebrity brands that have now come to the market. And it creates a little bit of a problem, because it means that then in order to have self-care, you actually have to have the financial means to purchase it. And without the financial means of purchasing it, somehow you don't have access to self-care. So the setup is a little bit money focused, let's say. And sometimes the market can create problems first, because it gives you a product to solve, right? Like, if let's make wrinkles a problem and then let's sell anti-wrinkle cream. Let's make gray hair a problem and let's sell hair products, right? So what happens is that we sometimes don't realize that the market can actually create these problems because it wants to provide us with a solution, because the solution has a financial gain. And listen, it's totally okay that this happens. This is the world that we live in. And I'm not advocating that we completely overhaul everything, because let's face it, that is way too big of an ask or a challenge. But what I am asking you is to really think about and reflect on self-care in your life. Because there may be individual things and individual focuses, but there's also structural focuses around, what is contributing to the stress to begin with that I need self-care for, right? And so I really want you to think about what are the things that you have relationships with work, with leadership, with employees, with people in your household, with relationships, with finances, with money, with all of these things that we have relationships with. Those are structural forces. And those things create a lot of stress in us. And stress shows up as worry and sleeplessness and anxiety and lack of focus and not being able to emotionally regulate and feeling that sense of just overwhelmed and tired and just done. You know what I'm talking about. Sometimes that hits on a Friday and sometimes that hits on a Tuesday. So there's all these factors that come into play that contribute to stress. And then our reaction is like, I need a little bit more self-care, or your friends tell you need self-care, or even your therapist tells you need self-care. And there hasn't been a lot of exploration around what the freaking hell does that even mean? So I want you to really rethink self-care a little bit. It's my invitation to enter into a different conversation around self-care. Because that term has kind of been co-opted a little bit. And it just doesn't sit right with me. Because it really is about having the resources for recovery and renewal, and for rest for somehow. Or somehow that, bodies are expendable. That, we need to spend more money, more time, more energy on it. When you actually are completely depleted of time. The irony is just so right there in our faces. And so I want you to shift into a different mindset that really understands that this current self-care setup can be challenged, where rest, setting boundaries, and prioritizing your actual well-being directly challenges the exploitative logic of the system right now. It really challenges how capitalism has made self-care a money problem that you have to purchase a ticket to have access to. But it doesn't have to be that way. it can be completely different. Like, you can have self-care without spending a dime. You can have self-care by saying no to things that demand your attention. So I want you to see boundaries as this like very revolutionary practice, because that's really what it is. Authentic and grounded and rooted self-care centers around boundaries as a form of resistance. And what does that actually mean? Because what it does, it means that we're rejecting the overwork of expectations. Setting our boundaries challenges, the capitalist extraction, let's say, of your time and money, especially for women expected to prove their worth through overperformance. So no more overworking, no more hustling, no more of that. Saying no is actually a complete sentence. Training ourselves to decline requests without a lengthy justification counters our socialization that we need to always put everybody else's needs before our own. No is a complete sentence. It really is. You don't need to explain yourself. And every invitation, we don't have to say yes to everything just because somebody asks. You have a right to say no. And the revolutionary practice around boundaries, again, is what I'm going to get to, which might be really uncomfortable for you, is around digital boundaries. Creating intentional technology-free spaces and times. And that pushes back against the constant availability expectations. We live in a time where we're weirdly expected to be available 24/7. And if it's not our business or our teams or work or, our careers or school, it's in our household. It's with children and spouses and parents and siblings and everything. I mean, your phone is constantly full of notifications. I mean, when is the last time you turned it all off and just went through a day with zero notifications? Like no notifications. Do you remember the last time you went through a day with some silence? And I'm going to guess that that's actually really rare, and that you probably cannot remember unless you were on vacation somewhere that had no Wi-Fi and no cell phone reception, and that brought on just a little bit of anxiety for you, but you pushed through it anyways. So I want you to think as rest as a radical resistance as well. Because I think that we are so hustle focused in that we need to schedule everything. And so maybe you need to schedule rest. And now that sounds really silly maybe, or kind of counterintuitive, but you schedule everything that's important, from dentist appointments to hair appointments to taking kids to soccer to making that team meeting to presentations you need to do. You schedule everything that's important. And I challenge you to look at your schedule and ask yourself how much of what's scheduled is actually for you, not for other people, but for you, for your own wellness, for your own self-care. And we need to schedule that rest if we need to. We need to have time to be unproductive. Valuing time without measurable output is so important, because it challenges this idea that all of our human activity has to be commodified. Like, it has to have value or have output or be effective or efficient or lead to something, or whatever happened to just being bored. Like, if you're over 40, you remember a time in history when you were a child and you were bored, and that's when you came up with your most creative ideas and endeavors. When's the last time as an adult you allowed yourself to be bored? And just to see what happens. We don't really need the constant stimulation. So digital boundaries are important. I challenge you to even take it further and take the apps off your phone and make your phone a phone and see what happens. We know self-care is about kind of taking on an anti-hustle resistant position, and exposing this hustle culture roots that we have, this idea of rise and grind, or just like pushing through it, or all these things, is what it does. It's profit over exhaustion. It's profit over wellness. It's self-exploitation for the sake of hustle. So we need to really push through and create those spaces of rest and resistance and being tech free and just being bored and not having to optimize everything about our time. Like we kind of live our lives like we're robots, like we're trying to optimize everything instead of just being a messy human being that just shows up and it has moments of boredom and creativity and just has expression and moves their body without having to measure something and having to constantly prove your efficiency and effectiveness. And like, what about just a day to read and drink some coffee and turn your phone off? That's what self-care is. It isn't the rosé all day, and it's not, the Instagram worthy photos. That's not self-care. Self-care is saying no. Self-care is rest. It's not glamorous. It's not pretty. It's not Instagrammable. Self-care sometimes is sweatpants and a sweatshirt and puttering around your house and your phone is actually turned off. Real self-care is about advocacy. It's about setting boundaries. And it's not this beautiful curated photo of perfection. And that's sometimes a hard thing for us to grapple with. A few things you can do and some strategies to kind of reclaim some authentic self-care, because I know that for many of us, like we've lost track of that, of what authentic self-care actually really is. And, or maybe none of us, like some people who are listening have never had that, and that's okay. There's no judgment. There's no shame in that. There's no guilt in that. It just is what it is. We accept it for what it is. But I really want you to think about some strategies. So, one, do a needs audit. Regularly assess actual needs versus conditional wants. And what that means is, do you actually need this, or have you been conditioned to want this? And I'll give you an example. I recently had my credit card hacked, or was compromised. So they had to cancel my credit card. And I'm still waiting for my credit card to come. They said 5 to 10 business days, and it feels like it's been a lifetime. But what this has done for me is that it's made me realize how easily I spend money online. How I add things to my shopping cart, how I will do these things, but I haven't been able to do it because I don't have a credit card. It also has made me realize how many of my subscriptions I actually don't need. I've been conditioned to want them, to have all the streaming services and all these things and access to things. But because my credit card's not working, everything's basically not being able to get processed. So I'm starting to lose my access to all of these things. And I'm realizing, one, how much that's conditioned in my life and that I actually don't really need it. So do a needs audit. Which kind of ties into, strategy number 2, which is like having consumption awareness. Notice when self-care becomes primarily about purchasing. And that is a hard one. Like I said, I have noticed how often my self-care has become about consumption. And I invite you into the challenge with me to know that you're not alone in this. And we're in this together, and I'm challenging that just as much as you might be. The third thing you do is permission practices. And what that means is actively giving yourself permission for rest, for boundaries, for needs. Getting used to giving yourself permission slip for these things, because no one else is going to give it to you. You need to get that for yourself. Stop looking outside of you for someone else to give you permission. You need to give yourself permission, because that's where the strength is. That's where you feel empowered. That's where the core of authenticity really lies, is inside of you. It's not inside of anybody else. 4, you can think about community care integration. So what does that mean? It means balancing individual care with mutual support of other people. There's something about being connected to community and being out and about in the world, whether that's volunteer work or your neighbors or your relationships. Is get really back into some of those community care integrations where you're serving. Research shows that when people are in service to others, so when they're helping others or engaged in volunteer work, over 3 months, a 3-month span, depression actually gets cut by half. So there's something about being in community with other people that has a lot of power. journaling is really, really important in all of this. And the big piece of that is also like thinking about the structural analysis. So what does that mean? It's taking the time to connect personal exhaustion to systemic issues and to avoid internalizing or pathologizing those things. So looking at systemic issues at work, at the organization that you are in, looking at your business, looking how you're running things and who you're being influenced by, who are you consuming, what messages are you consuming, looking at stress levels, and instead of thinking it's about you, looking at the bigger picture of it. That's really, really vital. And on the back end of that is looking at joy metrics. Right? So we're looking at structural things and joy things. And this is really easy through journaling because you can write it all out. But measuring well-being through joy and connection and purpose rather than productivity or appearance. Because listen, we're all getting old, and I look at my wrinkles and I think they're great laugh lines. And I think about the day, and I hope to get to 85 or 89. And I think about, what will I value then? And what I'm going to value is my joyful moments. I'm going to think about those happiness and those connections and purpose that I've had in life. It's not going to matter. There's no avoiding getting wrinkles. There's no avoiding, getting some gray hair. All of that happens. We just cover it up. For what? To make it a pretty picture? So we need to be focused on those things: joy, connection, purpose, alignment, authenticity instead of productivity, or instead of appearance. And the last thing I want you to do is to experiment with your boundaries, because they're not all created equal, and we all don't do them the same. We do them very differently. So I want you to practice with saying no, and saying no in little situations and big situations, and really protecting your time and your energy by saying no to the invitations or no to the requests, because you don't have to say everything. You don't have to say yes to everything. I want you to think about self-care from its original revolutionary roots of rejecting commercialization and individualistic, versions of people and everyone's out for themselves, in order to, favoring practicing that is much more, nurture wholeness. It's really more about nurturing yourself and being aligned and authentic and whole and having a holistic approach to things. And moving away from productivity and what something looks like, and really embrace self-care as a time to rest and to check out of all the digital stuff and technology and get back into who you really, really, really are. And, when you get back into that, self-care becomes a little bit easier. Trust me. It's not always easy to get there. The road to getting there is a little bit bumpy. So it is important to embrace the bumpiness and the messiness of it all, because it's not going to be a smooth ride. But I just know it's so worth it on the other end. I hope that you found today a really helpful episode. If you want to dive in and talk more about this or see if we're compatible to work together, there's a link in the show notes for a quick intake form for you to fill out. And let's just see if we're compatible to work together. If you want some help on boundaries, I'll put a link in the show notes for journaling for ambitious women, which is really, really helpful around, 5 days of how to journal and how to dive into some of these aspects and get to know yourself just a little bit better. I hope to see you next week.